Okay, now there's a couple more points I want to talk about before concluding this lecture. First is the relationship between the different principles. Okay, so according to Rawls, quote, these principles, A and B, are to be arranged in a serial order with the first principle prior to the second. This ordering means that a departure from the institutions of equal liberty required by the first principle cannot be justified by or compensated for by greater social and economic advantages. The distribution of wealth and income and the hierarchies of authority must be consistent with both the liberties of equal citizenship and equality of opportunity. Right? Even shorter version of the idea is that you cannot violate liberty for the sake of economic growth or material equality. Okay, that's the key idea here. So the principle A in our terminology is more fundamental than, or as Rawls says, is prior to principle B. And also the second part of principle B is prior to the first part of principle B. All right, so liberty has priority, as Rawls says. All right, so no matter how equal or unequal our society, we have to preserve liberty, despite all that. The next thing I want to talk about is the principle of choice that Rawls thinks we would be guided by, or we should be guided by, in the original position. And this is a principle called Maximun. All right, and here's what Rawls says about it. He says, it's useful as a heuristic device to think of the two principles that we would choose as the Maximun solution to the problem of social justice. There is an analogy between the two principles and the Maximun rule for the choice under uncertainty. This is evident from the fact that the two principles are those a person would choose for the design of a society in which his enemy is to assign him his place. The Maximun rule tells us to rank alternatives by their worst possible outcomes. We are to adopt the alternative, the worst outcome of which is superior to the worst outcomes of the others. Okay, so Maximun says maximize the minimum, right? Make sure you pick the choice where the worst outcome is the best of all the worst outcomes. Right, so that's Maximun. So the main alternative to Maximun is the strategy that tells us to maximize expected utility. Right, so what is expected utility? Well, the expected utility of a certain choice is the probability that that choice will lead to a certain outcome multiplied by the utility, the value of that outcome. And when we're told that the rational choice is the one that maximizes expected utility, that's to say that we consider our different choice possibilities, right? C1, C2, C3, and so on. And the rational choice is the one that has the highest product of probability times utility, right? As we see in the equation in front of you. So the choice you should pick, the rational choice, according to the theory that says we should maximize expected utility, is the one with the highest product of those two factors. That's the rational choice. Now, oftentimes, the choice that Maximun recommends will be different from the choice that maximizes expected utility. So why should we reason according to Maximun instead of expected utility? Well, Rawls argues that Maximun is the rational strategy in the original position because you should be more concerned with avoiding the terrible outcomes for yourself, given how terrible they can be, than anything else. Right? He says Maximun is rational because the bad effects could be so bad that we want to make sure that the worst things could be is not that bad. Okay, that's Rawls' argument for Maximun. But utilitarians, for example, argue that in the original position and in every other situation, the rational option is the one that maximizes expected utility. So even if the worst outcome might be pretty bad, you should choose the one that has the highest expected utility, right? Which is not crazy either. Now, this debate between advocates of Maximun, like Rawls, and advocates of maximizing expected utility, like utilitarian, has been one of the most important debates about Rawls's theory of justice, right? And here we can see another case where to solve problems of ethics or political philosophy, you have to make some really difficult choices down in the fundamental principles about not only ethics but rationality and so on. Right? Now, here's a question you should ask yourself: right? Where do you come down in this dispute? Right? If you're behind the veil of ignorance, right? Do you? Well, let's go back to our slide where we had equality and utility. So, if you had these two options, right, what do you think would be the most rational choice? Right? You could potentially do better in utility, but the worst you could do is worse in utility than it would be in equality, right? So Maximun, with just these two options, Maximun would say we should choose equality. But maximizing expected utility would tell us to choose the utility distribution. Which one do you think is more rational, right? Knowing that you don't know where you would end up after the thing. Now, the utilitarian option here is more of a gamble, right? You risk more. Things could be much worse for you than in the Maximun distribution, but things could also be much, much better if you luck out. So if you're a gambling person, you're going to like the utilitarian proposal. If you're more risk averse, you're going to like Maximun. Okay. So yeah, think hard about what the right option is. One of the final points here is it's important to point out that John Rawls, he sees himself as being a part of the Kantian moral tradition. Right? One of Rawls's main goals in writing a theory of justice and much other of his political work is to give a reasonable alternative to utilitarianism, which, as we've talked about, utilitarianism is probably the most widely used or most popular moral theory when it comes to public policy making, at least in the English-speaking world, right? America, Great Britain, and Australia. Rawls is a Kantian, all right? Now, here's one place where he expresses, page 42 is one place where he expresses his Kantianism and how he sees his two principles as helping to kind of embody it or help it flourish. He says, the question arises whether there are substantive principles which convey the idea that men are to be treated as ends and not as means only. If the parties wish to express this notion visibly in the basic structure of their society, in order to secure each man's rational interest in his self-respect, which principles would they choose? Now it seems that the two principles of justice, right, A and B, achieve this aim. For all have an equal liberty, and the difference principle explicates the distinction between treating men as a means only and treating them also as ends in themselves. To regard persons as ends in themselves in the basic design of society is to agree to forego those gains which do not contribute to their representative expectations. By contrast, to regard persons as means is to be prepared to impose upon them lower prospects of life for the sake of the higher expectations of others. Thus, we see that the difference principle, which at first appears rather extreme, has a reasonable interpretation. Right, so Rawls' idea here is that it's consistent with your dignity, with your self-respect, with your being an end in yourself, to choose the difference principle, to choose distributions that would be consistent with the difference principle. Because look, even if you're worse off than somebody else, you've kind of made sure that you've done as well as you can for yourself. Right? You're not accepting inequalities that make you better, you make you worse off so that others can be better off. Right? You're ensuring that there's this kind of reciprocal, mutual benefit for you of the social cooperation that is embodied in society. Right? So you're able to preserve your self-respect in a way that you might not be able to if you chose, for example, a utilitarian distribution. Right? So please do yourself a favor and think more about this, because this is where things get pretty deep.